quite magical it is that we're probably talking to people in every corner of this planet right now. Took very little time to set up, and we can have these great conversations. If you imagine how long it took to send a letter from Rome to London 2,000 years ago. This is a pretty spectacular breakthrough. Anyway, I want to welcome everybody. I'm Paul Gibbons, and welcome to the first in a series of Putting People First in Adopting AI. I'm going to introduce Neil Harrison in a minute. He is the founder and an AI change advisor. He's somebody that has his boots on the ground every day, and he also manages to take time to reflect and think deeply about things. And when James Healy and I began writing Adopting AI a year ago, he was already deep in the trenches with his galoshes on, making progress. James Healy is my co-author. He runs a company called the Behavioural Boutique in Perth, Western Australia. He runs the B Word podcast, which I understand has Joe Rogan running for the hills. Perhaps not, but quality, not viewership. He's a behavioral scientist, a culture change and change management expert. When I joined Deloitte about, golly, it's going on 5 years ago now, I got to meet all of some fantastic people, and James stood out as a shining light there, leading the behavioral science practice down in Australia. A guy with really novel and great ideas. You can find out about me by going to my website, but the things that I'm most known for are those books on change management, which is most of them. I won't say too much about me. I will say a little bit more about the book. Adopting AI came out on March the 17th, and it's a really frustrating and fun experience to write a book on AI, where when you finish writing a chapter or even finish writing a sentence, there'll be some post on LinkedIn or some news flash, which says what you just wrote is completely obsolete. It was like drinking from a fire hose, some of the content that went into creating the book. So it was both exciting, and we decided to start writing on March the 17th. It didn't mean progress on AI came to a grinding halt on March the 17th. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about that today. The book has something quite interesting in it. I'm going to quickly draw your attention to these scenarios where one of the things we ask people to consider in the book is whether we are charging at Mach 1 off a cliff with some of the left-hand side stuff going on in artificial intelligence, or whether, as some people would have us believe, we're heading to a new utopia, the like of which we may not have seen as a planet. So we leave you to consider that. The book has 3 sections in it: the why, the what, the background, some stuff on AI and education and AI and art that's not found in other books. The middle section is strategy, adoption, and learning, most of what we'll be talking about today. And the last section, 40% of the book, is on ethics and governance. The session today in the book, the middle section covers AI strategy, something we call adaptive adoption, and something we call learning to learn with AI. I invite you to get a copy, grab a copy if you're interested after today's discussion. We're getting, it's been very well reviewed. It's #1 in technology and society. So thanks for joining. Let me introduce you and hand over to Neil. I'm going to remove myself from the stage. Neil, if there's anything you need, just shout out and let me know.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thanks for the introduction, and I'm really looking forward to getting to the conversation. So what I'm going to do is take about 15 minutes. What I'd like to do is play back some of the key takeaways I took from the book. So I've got 4 key takeaways I want to talk to you about. Then I want to raise a couple of questions that I had reading through, and again, tease those out so that might spark some ideas for conversation. And then finish off with a quick comparison between the adaptive adoption approach and my own 4P AI adoption framework. And the idea is that we compare and contrast that to, again, tease out some thoughts and ideas for further discussion. So without ado, so key takeaways. So I've got 4 things really struck me quite a lot about the book, and the first 2 of which I think are particularly important. So I'm going to linger on those 2 in particular for a little bit. So the first one is around AI as a strategic intelligence, not just a technology. And I think for me, what this is really telling us is, as much as quick wins and automation through AI might be appealing, they're short term, and we need to be thinking much more strategically and systemically actually about how we adopt AI. And it certainly isn't the kind of digital transformation where we hand off to the IT department to deliver some tools. I think in particular what strikes me is the human AI collaboration potential. So when people come together at their best with the best of what AI can bring, actually that collaboration allows us to achieve things that weren't, hitherto possible, quite possibly. So that means we can reimagine work, we can reinvent business models, we can reinvent jobs, and it fundamentally changes leadership. How do you lead a team when you've got people collaborating with AI in a way that is doing things we've never seen before? So really quite inspiring, actually, idea about this AI as a strategic intelligence. The key thing for me in this is if we think about it in that term, we ought to be approaching it in a strategic approach. So I really like that in the book and what that brings out. That takes me to my second point, which is related, of course. If we don't have the right mindset, the right cultures or leadership behaviors, how are we going to achieve that reimagining the future? Now, when you talk to a change community about the importance of mindset and leadership, this is nothing new, of course. I do think, though, with AI, it is something that we need to take really seriously, because the opportunity, I think, that exists and the risks that exist are much greater, I would argue. So if we're leading an ERP program and we don't get the leadership behaviors and the culture and the mindset right, we delay delivery, costs us a couple of million more, and we don't get the value we hope for in terms of return on investment. It's not ideal, but it's not going to put you out of business. I think if we get this mindset, culture, and leadership behaviors wrong with AI, we do fundamentally, I think, risk falling behind our competitors who get this right. So I think there is much greater opportunity, but also greater risk. Now, I like in the book, in particular, the discussion around systems thinking and complexity. And I think this is a really nice way to think about how we can start to become adaptive in our response to, the relentless pace that Paul was alluding to just now. So if we're thinking beyond our stovepipe, beyond our team, beyond our function, then looking at the wider implications of what we're doing is going to allow us to open up our minds about what opportunities exist in the system, in the complex system that we're operating within the organization. And through looking at the feedback loops that those systems create, we can learn from that feedback and adapt more easily. So looking beyond our silos, looking at interconnections, but of course also looking at the outside world where that sort of control is beyond, is beyond us. So those things I think are really important in terms of how we approach, a learning organization, if you like, adaptive learning. The other aspect that Paul and James talk about in the book is around the human skills. So again, I think really important, if we're bringing our best selves in terms of emotional intelligence and critical thinking to that relationship with AI, we're going to get more from it. So the first two, AI as a strategic intelligence and mindset, culture, and leadership really matter. I think if you take nothing else, these are really critical for successful adoption. The other two I want to raise, because this is largely around change management, and these are quite relevant for that. So the third point is, the authors argue, change can't be a linear A to B process. Well, I mean, they'd argue, I'd argue too. So with AI, if we look at the pace of innovation, there's lots that we can look at here. But if we look at the pace of innovation, how on earth can anyone predict a future state? So for those that have been in change, we know we define a future state, we map out our current state are to be, and then we typically draw a line between the two and expect to achieve that result. That's classic, I suppose, traditional approach. If we can't predict the future with AI, then how are we doing that? How do we actually set out a change to a future state that we can't possibly predict? So does that mean change doesn't have a beginning, middle, and end with AI? Is it a one-off event, as we would see in classic project work, or is it continuous? So let's have a pick that up in the discussion as well. Now the fourth point then I want to draw out is what the authors call what is your what, and I call what is your why for AI. And this is about being really crystal clear about what your problem or your opportunity is. So if you're defining the problem and opportunity at a level that you really understand it at the root cause, you're not playing whack-a-mole. And what I find here actually is, because there's so much FOMO about AI and a rush to adopt tools, almost always I get asked, what tool shall I use? What tool shall I use for? And it's just, for me, the wrong place to start. It's the wrong question. I mean, if we think about that human AI collaboration and the art of the possible for the future, we just can't imagine today. Really, I think the question isn't what tool, but can I improve this process? Can I actually fundamentally redesign this process when I'm working with AI to achieve things I couldn't have done before? I mean, there's a practical point about the tools, and that is that there's around 34,000 of them. So no one's going to know of those which the best one is, and it's going to vary in context. So in order to get the best definition of your problem and opportunity, one of the other things the authors talk about is that needs to happen bottom up. So those people closest to the opportunity or the problem are probably best placed to define what it is. So those are the four key takeaways. AI is a strategic intelligence, mindset, culture, leadership behaviors in particular matter a great deal. Change can't be linear A to B, and what is your what? Define your problem and opportunity. Now, there's lots more I could draw out in the book, but those are the four that I'll leave you with. I now want to just reflect on a couple of questions, then I'll do the comparison. So the questions I have, and actually moving on from the bottom-up approach, whilst I agree with that approach, I also think that can risk a sense of anarchy. If we've got lots of empowered people doing lots of innovation across the organization, popping up everywhere, how do we assure ourselves that's strategically aligned? How do we assure ourselves it's coherent? And how do we know it's not all trying to draw on the same resource and not getting anywhere? So there is, for me, a question around how do we actually assure ourselves that it's broadly heading in the right direction and it's coherent across the different initiatives. Now, I know I said you can't predict the future, but you can define a future state that allows you to set as a North Star, if you like, to draw people towards it. The second point is that, as much, again, as I like what's in the book, it's really ambitious. I think to get from where we are to that state is no easy task. And I can't say I've seen an organization that I've gone into that I think, yeah, this is going to be a couple of weeks and we'll be in this mode. I'm not saying the authors argue for this, by the way, but there's a lingering question in my mind around how do we get from here to an adaptive adoption approach. And maybe that's a follow-on book, Paul and James, but I think there's a question around that as well. So I'm just going to do a quick canter through the comparison, and then I think we'll open up to discussion. So I have a proprietary AI adoption framework called 4 Ps: prepare, propose, pilot, and progress. And I'd like to do a compare and contrast with the adaptive adoption model that's described in the book. So prepare, then, to start, is effectively about getting the leadership foundations in place and ensuring that leaders are setting the guardrails, the responsible AI usage. I've looked through the adaptive adoption, and actually what I see in there is prioritize behaviors and integrate ethics. It's completely the same thing, and reassuring. The second P, propose, so prepare, propose, is about your why for AI, or what is your what, as the authors talk about. So there's a good alignment there. In addition, for propose, I believe we need to look at that strategic alignment question, how we stop the anarchy of innovation. So what's the strategic alignment, coherence? Is it desirable, feasible? Do we have some measurable benefits? What are the risks? Those kind of things that might slow things down, but I think are maybe necessary, at least initially, to check whether we're heading broadly in the right direction. Then the third P, pilot, is about iterative experimentation. So a lot of design thinking principles in this. Again, James and Paul talk about embrace complexity, accept democracy, and enable experimentation. I couldn't be more aligned with that view in the pilot phase. And then finally, the last P, progress, is about how we then, with the good ideas, how we then scale those ideas, if necessary, across the organization or function or team, and how we continuously optimize that solution. So, and again, adaptive adoption talks about continuously evolving. And I think that's that key point, is that once you launch, as it were, once you scale, you've had the cupcakes, it doesn't end. You need to keep monitoring because of all the changes happening. So again, argues, I think, for that continuous approach. So what I'd say is we've developed these in isolation, as it were. We've not developed these together, but I'm struck by just how much alignment there is across the two models. Really good. And then I'm just going to end there. I'm going to say congratulations to the authors. I loved the book. I thought it was really well researched. It was well written, thought-provoking, funny actually, and really inspiring. So thanks for letting me read it, and congratulations.
Thank you. This is new technology, and this is the StreamYard. It's new for me. It's not new. And I had a vision that using it, that we would all be gathered around like backstage at a Taylor Swift concert, and that it would be time for one of you listening from wherever you are on the globe to jump in and comment, because there are 100 of you here, and the wealth of that experience is something that we'd like to learn from, as well as having your feedback and comments and to interact. So I'd like to invite you to do that in the LinkedIn Live questions, comments on LinkedIn. There's a link to join StreamYard. And so while I ask Neil a few questions, I'd love for people to jump in, whether you have a question or whether you have a comment or whether you have an insult or whatever it is. But come and be backstage with Taylor Swift, our version of Taylor Swift, of course, Neil Harrison, and participate in the discussion. That was really the vision. And then the next time, I shall send them a rude email and see if I can figure out how this might have gone, how we might all have been gathered here together. But do jump in using that StreamYard link. Neil, tell me a little bit. You're working day in and day out on this stuff, right? So what can you say about your current client engagement, within the bounds of confidentiality, how it's going, what you're working on with them, how you're working with them? What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, it's quite varied, actually. So I've got a number of different offers, so which I won't go into. But what I find is that almost always the first engagement feels like we're talking about a digital transformation program that we've been doing for 20 years. So typically, I'm talking to the IT director. We're talking about technologies that we're looking to implement and how we can engage teams, adopting use cases. And of course, based on what we've just described, that's probably not the kind of place we want to start. So I would say for the most part, the conversation really is around trying to move beyond that and actually, yes, let's get people engaged. Let's start to understand what their problems are. Let's workshop some of their problems with them. Let's hold off on selecting tools and co-create these definitions of problem statements and so on that we can then work through to get to solutions. So that's not always easy. So there's I suppose a category like that, and I would say in the UK that's probably the majority.
And in doing this, if I may interrupt, what you're using some traditional change management, it sounds like. What are you using from the sort of traditional change management toolkit, and what you be doing, or what approach might you be taking that wouldn't be found in, pick a traditional change management framework?
I draw on, I haven't used traditional change frameworks where given the choice for a while. For the reasons that we've described in the introduction, actually, that a lot of that complexity and uncertainty isn't new with AI. Of course, it's just exacerbated. But I think this gets to the point. One of my two questions really about the book. We need to be able to meet the client where they are, and quite often, at least in the UK, the clients are in a digital transformation space. So we've got to find ways to move them from that into much more adaptive approaches. And typically they're not asking for, leadership development around the behaviors, although I've done work like that with leadership teams, which is much more encouraging and rewarding in many regards. But typically it's trying to move away from the sense that, we define the answer in the center somewhere. And then, so actually, I find design thinking in particular a useful approach here. So, co-creation. We're asking questions. Well, hang on, before we jump to this IT tool that we've got, before we jump to Copilot, which you have installed, let's really understand what it is different teams are trying to achieve through workshopping with them. So what if questions, and what works. What wows, and those kind of questions, I think you can begin to break down this sense that we are pushing a solution on people and that they are engaging, identifying the issues that really affect them the most. And I think that's the key turning point.
We've got a couple of people who've joined us. One of them is my co-author, James Healy, who jumped in. Other people in the LinkedIn comments or the LinkedIn chat. I saw Esther, you made a very good remark. Do jump in and have your say. James, is there something that you wanted to contribute here? You're on stage now. I'm going to remove my.
Fabulous. So I guess I've got the mic. Neil, can you just give me a thumbs up that you can hear me? Fabulous. Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for joining. Obviously, I have a huge amount to add to this. Paul and I wrote a 280-page book, so we have a lot of thoughts. I think in terms of where we are in the discussion at the moment, one of the things I would highlight that's at the heart of this adaptive adoption framework or principles as we propose them is this idea that adopting AI is totally different to adopting any previous technology, because it's unlike, say, doing an SAP implementation where the use cases are obvious, the use cases are baked into the nature of the platform. The platform itself is mechanistic, it's predictable. Ultimately, someone can go have a look at the source code and understand what it's done. Even if you've never written a line of code in your life, you have baked in the assumption that computer systems are predictable, logical. If I do A, I will get B. If I don't, it's because I've probably not done A quite right. AI, and particularly generative AI, and we use the terms interchangeably in the book, and I think most people are currently using them interchangeably, albeit inaccurately. Generative AI is not like that. It's emergent, it's unpredictable, it's opaque. And that raises a whole suite of issues that make it completely unlike the sort of linear systems that we're all used to. And it therefore becomes much more of a cultural transformation than a tech transformation. It's about experimentation. And I'm interested in people's thoughts on this, but my experience, every organization I've ever been in as an employee or a consultant pays lip service to innovation and experimentation. Oh, we test and learn, we fail fast. The vast majority of them do not. And traditionally, one of the big reasons for that is there is a fear of failure. You can experiment as long as you succeed, but what we don't want is a failed experiment, because failure will be problematic for you professionally. And you still have that challenge with AI. But you also have the challenge that people are afraid of success. Because if I experiment with AI and I automate 30% of my job, I need to feel really confident telling my boss that. And my boss needs to feel really confident telling his or her boss that. And so you end up with this almost jaws of death situation that people are afraid to succeed, they're afraid to fail. And you end up with a lot of secret AI use. Or in my experience, you end up with a lot of people who are just too busy to actually try it. And again, I'm interested in thoughts from others, but I've encountered a number of organizations who have just dropped Copilot on everybody at great expense and are now wondering why people aren't using it. Well, we've given it to them. And it's very much the classic field of dreams approach. Build it and they will come. Unfortunately, real organizations are not a Kevin Costner movie. I will pause there. I'm keen on hearing other thoughts, Neil or anyone else.
We have a guest on. We have a guest on here, JC, who joined and then left. Neil, what do you think about what James just said?
Yeah, all that resonates. I think the thing about afraid to fail is for me that is really important, because it does feel a real blocker trying to create that psychological safety and just thinking about it in different ways. I like the analogy of a scientist in a lab. So a scientist has a hypothesis that they're testing, and so they test the hypothesis. They get some data back. It's either proven right or it's proven wrong. But either way, it doesn't matter. It's data that allows you to then move on. So when I'm talking to clients, I'll use that as an analogy, because I think it helps to reframe it slightly. So anything is data that you can move forward from, basically. On the afraid to succeed point, again, also really important. I recall talking to a internal comms team, and the leader said, "Yeah, we've tried AI and it doesn't work." I think, okay, what happened? Well, I asked the team, how could we save some resources, and could they go away and work it out with AI? Right. Okay. So, and there's this sort of, turkeys don't vote for Christmas sort of thing about that, isn't there? So I think also that point about reframing, I come back to the human AI collaboration thing. Yes, there are opportunities in automation, but actually, if we can build this around being able to do things that you couldn't hitherto do, actually that's quite inspiring and rewarding. So I get that there's going to be some tension there with wanting to reduce costs, but I think we need to be honest about what those opportunities look like.
It's funny. I used to do a bunch of coaching back 20 years ago, back with senior execs, and they say, "Oh, I'm so stiff, I'm not playing." I said, "Why don't you give yoga a try?" He said, "I tried yoga once, I was too stiff for it." I'm like, I heard someone say it with golf too. I tried golf once, I wasn't any good. There's a sort of default mindset that we ought to be able to learn complex things in an instant, and it's not the way you learn mathematics. You spent 12 years studying it when you're in high school, and maybe more when you're in uni. It's not the way anything interesting, anything complex, and anything useful is learned in the world. But somehow or another, and this is something we touch upon in chapter 6 of the book, which I had a lot of fun writing, is at the top there's this idea, if I don't know it, it's probably not that useful. And leaders are making exactly the wrong moves. There's a lot of talk about AI literacy, but they have imagined that AI literacy starts with some sheep dip course rolled out through the bottom of the organization, rather with you guys. What are you reading? Have you been on a 2-week course at Harvard Business School, for the sake of argument, and look deeply into this technology in the future? Probably not. No, and I find that tragic. And the other thing is, managers are sometimes do the opposite of what they are supposed to do when it comes to learning in organizations. Is they begrudgingly or resist. Have you ever had a manager? I think you might. If we were all standing around in the Taylor Swift backstage here, so most of us had a manager said, "Do you really need to go on that course? We're quite busy right now." Or, oh gosh, do you really need to do 6 days training next year in your performance objectives? Can't we get by with it a little less? We're under our margins are under pressure. And you see people in organizations, leaders and managers in organizations, doing the opposite of what they're supposed to be doing to enable learning in any kind of meaningful way. So anyway, I'm glad this came up. I meant to take a backstage, but I've got on one of my hobby horses, which is about learning in organizations.
Oh no, now you've left. Okay. It's back to Neil and I. There's something deeply ironic about running a webinar on AI and being stumped by the technology, but we shall move seamlessly onwards. I'm going to pick up on a couple of questions and comments in the chat. So Mobeen Anwar, do you find a lot of times people don't know what it is that they want, and so there is some ignorance about what AI can do? I find that all the time. I think there is a level of education that you can help with, but I think the unfortunate reality is the use cases aren't obvious, and the use cases can't really be defined top down, which is very uncomfortable for a lot of organizational leaders. The use cases really need to be figured out through experimentation, and that's why I describe it as a cultural transformation. It's about creating the space for people to experiment and figure out what those use cases are, because they will differ from organization to organization and from context to context. That leads us seamlessly into Angelina's point. In the real world, the constraints mean putting guardrails around the space for experiments, lab protocols analogy, so that bad actors, CISO, data protection, legal concerns, etc., can be dealt with. I've got some thoughts on that, but Neil, I'm keen to hear your thoughts on that. I loved your lab analogy, so maybe let's run with that. How do you embed those lab protocols, to torture the metaphor a bit more?
I think I think this idea that we need to experiment to learn what we can achieve is important. And so initially, I think, helping leaders understand the value of an approach or principles like design thinking, for example, where we're engaging teams to really understand what the problem is. And that systems thinking that allows us to unpick, so we're not playing whack-a-mole all the time. We're trying to play whack-a-mole all the time with the problems that are escalating, that we take the time to define the problem. And we so often rushing to a tool that we actually lose sight of what the problem is. I find when we take the time to define the problem, people become excited about the opportunity of removing it, or if it's an opportunity, they become excited about the opportunity. So it begins to build a momentum on its own when you co-create and you engage people and you identify what they want to address. And through that process, you can begin to, ideate about the art of the possible, this idea about what if, and then narrow our options down, setting criteria around, cost, security, scalability, desirability, those sorts of things. And once you've got a set of criteria in place, it now becomes a bit more managed, as it were. And through that process, you can identify a few solutions that you can kick the tires on. And through that experiential learning, you're learning about the technology and you're understanding which solution might fit you best to scale if that's where it's going. So again, I think this sort of co-creating and being crystal clear about the problem really helps in this approach.
Yeah, thanks. I agree with all that. I think the build I would add is, and I think it was Angelina's question, the ethical part of this is really, really tricky. And again, I'm interested in thoughts. Drop them in the LinkedIn chat, if you will. How are people finding this with their organizations? Because I have grave concerns that certainly in bigger organizations, the risk and compliance and legal teams are going to be able to get sufficiently comfortable with this, because they are used to dealing with technology that is predictable, that is transparent, where there are error logs. They're not set up to deal with technology which is unpredictable, does strange emergent things that no one can predict in advance, and for which there are often no good error logs and no good retrospective explanations. And again, my slightly provocative take on this is organizations are not set up for technology that behaves in those ways, but organizations are set up for people that behave in those ways. And that's one of the reasons why we need to treat this more as an intelligence than as a technology or a tool, because I would hate to be a fly on the wall for the conversation with the chief counsel, where you explain that, yeah, we don't know necessarily what this thing is going to do. And there have been plenty of examples where AIs have gone rogue and caused legal issues. There's a huge sustainability impact that we can't control. There's a huge potential for bias, etc., etc., etc. These are not scenarios that, organizations are used to dealing with from their technology.
Could I just, James, it will be interesting just to unpick that a bit further. So, I mean, ethics is, for me at least, extraordinarily difficult thing to describe in a way that is going to make sense to every organization. And so there's an element for me about facilitating a conversation that allows them to define what ethical guardrails they want to put in place for themselves. Could you unpick that process for us a little bit? Because I mean, ethics, I've read the section in the book. It wasn't an area I focused on for this particular discussion, but I think that challenge of how it needs to be tailored to every organization, and how do you go about that?
Well, I think one of the things we say in the book is, again, and I'm not picking on SAP. I know there's at least a couple of people here who've got SAP in their LinkedIn title, so I'm not picking on SAP, I promise. But we use SAP as an example because implementing an SAP or a Salesforce or whatever, pick your big enterprise cloud vendor, it's largely ethically neutral. And it's certainly ethically neutral by the time it gets to the end user, most of the time. I'm sure there's some wild scenarios you can come up with where it's not ethically neutral, but on average, it's ethically neutral. Whereas this is different. The sustainability angle, for example, raises some ethical concerns. And should you really be using it to replace simple Google searches? I'm sure we've all seen the data on how much more power is used, how much more water is used. That's an example. Bias. Now, this is a really easy topic to make sweeping statements about, and I see stuff on this all the time in my LinkedIn feed. We need to eradicate the bias from AI. Now, this is being recorded, so I want to be very clear with what I'm about to say. I don't want to be misquoted on this. Of course, we would like to eradicate outright prejudice uses of AI which lead to detrimental outcomes for particular populations. That is, of course, something that everyone would sign up to. But it's a lot easier said than done, because all information, all data sets are biased just by virtue of inclusion or exclusion. If you choose to omit certain bits of data, that is bias. Who, and Paul, I know you've got a lot of thoughts on this, who exactly is going to decide what is biased and what is not? Which politicians, which leading technologists would we like to entrust this decision to? Answers on a postcard, please. So again, there are no glib answers to this, but as part of the rollout, we need to equip people in organizations to at least have some awareness of these ethical constraints, and ideally set them up to ask some ethical questions of themselves and of others when they're using it, which is a really easy thing to say on a webinar and a really, really hard thing to do in reality. Paul, thoughts on ethics from you?
Well, there's so much. It's kind of a peculiar thing. I was a professor briefly of business ethics, and so I swam in the very deep waters of business ethics, talking about Enron and Volkswagen and FIFA and the myriad of ethical scandals. I kind of became an expert in ethical scandals, and one of the things that I see as a member of the ethics faculty was that it's housed in a place called the Legal Studies Department of the Business School. Now, that is emblematic of the way that sometimes ethics is thought about in business, is what can we get away with? In other words, we'll sail up to the line drawn by the law, and if we trespass the other side of the line, sometimes the highest ROI decision will be to pay the penalty. And this has happened with coal plants in the United States, and it happened famously with the Ford Pinto in the 1970s in the United States, is that the ethics department, aka the legal department, said, you know what, it's going to be more expensive for us to try and fix this systemic problem than it is to break the law and suck up the fines. And I think that's a confusion that won't do for AI. First of all, in everywhere apart from the European Union, go Europe, AI is substantially unregulated. There is almost no AI regulation in the United States. And what really sparse legislation there was a really toothless piece of legislation introduced by Biden. He couldn't pass it through the traditional political route through the US Congress. So he signed an executive order saying, very simply, if you're in a government agency, you should be taking AI safety, seriously. Is that sort of policy recommendation that was wiped out by the incoming administration. So it's an ethical Wild West right now. So that's one worry I have about AI, is governments aren't, and perhaps this is understandable, moving quickly enough to put the kind of guardrails in that can protect the citizenry. And it's a democratic principle that people ought to have a say in matters which affect them. That's why we have democracies. You get to vote on things, usually through your elected representatives. There's not anything, direct democracy does not yet exist. That's maybe something AI can help us with. We ought to have a say, but someone sometime has decided that AGI was a good idea. And you know what? I was never asked, and I don't think anybody on this call was asked. Somebody somewhere has decided that artificial superintelligence is a good idea. Now, it might be, and I tend to lean optimistic rather than pessimistic, but nobody asked me whether I thought it was a good idea. And so, and this is part of the Scylla and Charybdis that we talk about in the book, is if you tighten too much and too early and constrain too much development early by putting in ethical constraints, you may well stifle innovation. And there's some evidence that that happened with the GDPR in Europe. But if you don't do enough when it comes to something where the stakes are high as they are with AI, you're risking, not just the sorts of breaches that happened in 2008. 2008 was limited to the financial system, the meltdown there. We're talking about something that could be far more systemic and far worse. super intelligence now that has autonomy. And we cover this in the book. Is like, are we heading for something that looks like the Matrix type scenario? So I don't want to wax on too much, but the one chapter that I started to write on ethics, then James joined me, and between us, we managed to get out 5 chapters. We do cover the difference between ethics and governance and risk and the law, because they're different things. And I'll close with one ethical principle that a business ethicist would say is we want to do less than the law permits and more than it requires. And that's the stance that I think business leaders are going to have to take. We're going to have to stay inside these really not very good guardrails that have been drawn for us by the law, because it can sometimes take decades to pass legislation. And we want to do less than it permits and more than it requires of us. And that, why is that? To keep the citizenry safe, to keep our customers safe, to keep our suppliers safe, and ultimately in the terms of sustainability, to keep the planet safe. And so I want business leaders to think like that. It's not what can I get away with. What was your quote, James, from Jurassic Park? What was it? We have a lot of Jurassic Park in the book.
Well, it's the famous quote from the mathematician Ian Malcolm. So as the wheels start to come off and the planet starts to break down, Ian Malcolm turns and says to Richard Attenborough's character, I can't remember, but the guy who's created the whole thing, the whole park, your scientists spent so long thinking about whether or not they could do this, they didn't stop to think whether they should. And I think it's a quote that sums up so much about technology and so much about technology development, particularly AI.
One of the things that I really liked about that section, Paul, James, was the kind of focus coming back to this people, planet, profit thing, and framing the decision making and the actions that we take in that context. And I think, on good days, that keeps me going in terms of, if we can create innovation that has that in mind, then this is going to lead to good things. Of course, on other days, it's very difficult to think that way when we see actually, some of the things going on in the big tech in particular that's driving a lot of this, that doesn't necessarily align to that view. And I think that's where, I get worried about not having enough control, policy legislation in place to sort of rein back the big tech that might just go too far.
Well, we're running, I actually kind of wish this could go on for 2 hours, but, I want to respect the time that we said that things would take. I want to thank Neil for jumping in to do this. And I want to thank James for providing, as usual, very stimulating food for thought. And I want to invite everybody to connect with us on LinkedIn, the usual stuff. I promise not to. I promise to accept. And then also, if the topics that we've covered, AI adoption, AI strategy, AI learning, AI governance, AI ethics, yada yada, are interested you, do check the book out. We're very proud of it. It's like giving birth. You want your kid to do well. So really appreciate you joining. I really do also want to footnote this by saying I do apologize for some of the clumsiness there. This is the first time I've ever used this software. It's great software. I'm very impressed with it. But like with AI, you sort of have to know what you're doing. And that wasn't ultimately the case here. So I apologize for some of the rougher aspects of this. Neil, last remarks. James, last remarks, and then we'll head out.
Well, thank you very much. I think it's a great book. I do recommend everyone take a read of it. I'm not on commission, by the way, but it's definitely worth a read. Well done. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you, everyone, for joining. My closing remarks would be: we talked a lot about experimentation and the power of failing fast and testing and iterating. And I like to think that we role modeled that with some of the tech clumsiness. So Don't take our word for it. We we live our values, don't we, Paul?
Never miss a chance for a good positive spin there, James. That's nice. All right then.
Thank you all.
Thank you everybody for joining.
Thank you.